On the 4th of October 1936, a part of East London, not far from Aldgate, became a battlefield. Nothing like it had been seen before. For this was the day the British fascists attempted to march through the Jewish East End, and when 250,000 Londoners mobilized to prevent them. It became known in days to come as the Battle of Cable Street. This was, and is, London at its poorest and most vulnerable. One man planned to bring to this bleak place the harsh and alien message of fascism. His name is Sir Oswald Mosley, and this name still echoes through his old haunts.
Shall I tell you something, Georgie? Georgie, and I'll bet you even pound, Mosley's theme and policy was England for the English, and he said the rest. Yeah. Am I right?
You're right. English for the English.
Yeah, that was it, because he'd have hated the Jews, he would have hated the coloured, and he'd have hated everybody else. And I'll tell you who would have been left here: Mosley, Northcliffe, Rothermere, Leverhulme, the lot, and they'd have had what was left. And I'll tell you, you'd have been in the gutter.
To some, Mosley may only be a confused memory, but not to East End Jews.
Anti-Semitism was the basis of his work.
There's no justification in calling Mosley a saviour. Mosley's a nothing, he's a nobody. He just used the political situation at the time to further his own ends at the expense of the Jews of East London.
Give him a proper answer: a murderer, like all fascists are murderers. That's the right answer, and truthful answer.
Fascism was a terribly meaningful thing in the 30s. It loomed over Europe like a storm cloud. And its apostle in Britain was Sir Oswald Mosley, who even now, in his self-imposed exile, has never given up.
Really, these strange events, as they must be to this generation, of long ago, should be studied in their background. That is what is really important about it. Why were we there? What were we doing? Sometimes said we wanted to impose ourselves in some way on the people of East London. That's quite untrue. Our vote in East London the following March, after these events, was 23% in Bethnal Green and 19% in Limehouse. And that was an old people's vote. Householders only had the vote in the LCC election. Young people who were with us at that time had no vote. And in a parliamentary election, we should clearly have won. But a large and organized crowd from far afield, little to do with East London, were brought there to stop us doing what we'd often done before, to have a propaganda march through East London.
Cable Street was one of the punctuation marks of our times, for it was there that the Londoners looked fascism in the eye and said no. Oswald Mosley had been England's most brilliant misfit. He was rich and clever and one of the white hopes of the Labour Party, until he looked across the Channel and found new models in two men, called Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. If fascism could succeed in Italy and Germany, why not in Britain? That was what Mosley put to the nation.
Fascism is new to Great Britain. Because it is new, it will be attacked by some and laughed at by others. Fools always laugh at what they do not understand.
Indeed, the concept of fascism was new, at least in London. Fascism was patriotism perverted into power. It was law and order corrupted into tyranny. It believed that only authority was needed to control a nation's thought for its own good. There were many in those depressed days who feared trouble from the hungry and frustrated and unemployed, and who said that discipline was the only answer. Mosley's movement, the Black Shirts, became the British Union of Fascists, and it was not short of rich support. Lord Nuffield gave a cheque for £50,000. Lord Rothermere bestowed the backing of his Daily Mail. But by and by, Mosley lost the patronage of the Daily Mail. He would not dissociate his movement from Hitler and the methods of the Nazis. Jewish firms withdrew their advertising from the Mail, and the Mail withdrew its sponsorship of Mosley. The black shirts, outside the political mainstream, took to the streets in uniform.
I was myself, of course, a soldier, as you know, probably, of the First War. I fought in air and I fought in trench. And I did revert, half of me reverted, to my original profession, which was being a professional soldier. And I have admitted publicly, the old soldier rather got the better of the politician when I allowed to be worn a very military uniform. We began with an ordinary black shirt, and then we developed a full military uniform, because soldiers, which we then become, anyhow half of our movement had become, do like a smart uniform.
And Mosley's fascists moved in where the ground was fertile, as they thought, into the dim and dispossessed region of the docks and slums. There lived Bill Fishman, now principal of an East End college.
For months on end, our fathers were in the dole queue, walking the streets seeking work. Food was scarce. There was a feeling of despair and frustration. It was a common sentiment, a common experience to all peoples of East London. And above all, there was the eternal slums, the litter, the dirt, the filth, the futility of it all.
One man argued that he could bring purpose and order to the demoralized East End. Mosley, with his political melodrama.
In the lives of great nations comes a moment of decision, comes a moment of destiny. And this nation again and again in the great hours of its fate has swept aside convention, has swept aside the little men of talking of delay, and has decided to follow men and women who say we go forward to action. So let who dare follow us in this hour. That is the permanence, the mighty mood of Britain.
It was in tenements like these that both the Jews and the non-Jewish peoples of East London lived. They all shared a common fate. They were really the dispossessed, the poor, in cramped houses, underfed, working in sweatshops, subject to constant threats of unemployment. It was in this area of tension that the fascist build-up in East London emerged.
It's very easy in a time of economic crisis to turn to a scapegoat. And in the East London, the scapegoat was evident, the Jews. They were still an alien community. And this is part and parcel of fascism, to sort out a minority which is defenseless and use it as a weapon, as an attempt to seize power. I remember those meetings very well. I used to stand at the back of the crowd, probably as much as out of cowardice as anything else. And the scenes are very bright to me today. There were, in the front were the masses of these black-shirted warriors, and a van would draw up, and then on top of the van a bright light would shine on a figure climbing up. It was the leader himself, and one could hear the chanting, M-O-S-L-E-Y, we want Mosley. At that time it used to hit me right in the guts, because Mosley to me personified all that was evil in my experience. He got up, arms akimbo. I can see him now. He's very handsome, very dignified. And He came over, not like his fellow dictators in Europe, with the rancor and ranting, sort of subhumans. He was rational in his argument, and he reached his crescendo very slowly. And when he did, up would jump the frontline members shouting, "Hail Mosley!" And one could hear also, "Perish Judah, down with the Jews."
Someone who was not a Jew was aware of all this, who taught for years in a college in the heart of the East End, Edith Ramsay.
Indeed, Mosley did have a measure of success, because whereas before his activities, relationships throughout the whole district were very easy, and well, we took Jewish differences for granted, and they took our differences for granted. After Mosley, one became very conscious, one was speaking to a Jew, and the Jews were, I think, very naturally, on the outlook for signs of disapproval, of anti-Semitism, wherever they could see them, and detected them in the minds of their most ardent well-wishers. It became not quite a normal relationship. That was what Mosley did.
The Jew is not, I think the Jews will agree, are not immune from criticism. That is, if a Jew does something wrong, then he's as liable to be criticized as you or I. Actually, take ourselves back to that period. Prior to the war, the position was more normal. Since the war, I, like many other people, have been particularly sensitive to that question because the Jews were so terribly vilely treated in Germany, which I and everyone else has condemned. But at that time, they were in a normal position. And if a Jew was shouting for war, as we thought, he would be attacked.
Already Hitler had started his persecution of the Jews. There were tales leaking through of the concentration camps, of Jews being beaten up in the streets, of being deprived of their jobs, of their citizenship. And this, in effect, focused the home enemy in the person of Mosley and in the persons of his movement.
The persons of his movement had now become a private army, marching in mimicry of the stormtroop trappings of Nazi Berlin, and threatening the Jews with the sound and symbol of the jackboot.
We were constantly in a state of tension, particularly in the Stepney and Bethnal Green area. We were already subjected in the news to what was going on in Germany, and here, at first hand, we were feeling the impact of a similar sort of experience. In the papers, there were tales of young Jewish children being thrown through windows. There were marauding gangs of men in black shirts picking on Jewish people here and there and injuring them.
There was the terrible and I think isolated occasion when a Jewish girl was caught in Whitehorse Lane and was strapped to some hoarding in the attitude of the crucifixion. A girl of 13, perhaps 12. And at their public meetings, their gospel was, get rid of the Jews. Why is everything wrong? Why weren't these people living in the houses they wanted? The Jews were living in them. Why didn't they have the jobs they wanted? The Jews had got those jobs. Why did we keep the Jews in England when every civilized country in Europe was getting rid of them? The Jews were bribing our government.
I often used to go away feeling are we Jews like this? And often when he used to call out that international finance, the alien domination of British politics, my mind used to go to my own father, who was a poor tailor wandering through the East End looking for work. How could one equate this with those international alien financiers who were eroding Britain, according to Sir Oswald Mosley?
Well, the answer to that is that the policy of the party was never to attack anyone, Jew or anybody else, on the ground of race or religion. And I define anti-Semitism as attacking a Jew on those grounds. If anyone, over a period of time and after warning, did that, attacked Jews as Jews, it will be found, whoever they were, they ceased to be members of the party.
Nevertheless, the black shirts had their own press, like the publication Action. One of its endless themes was insult and mockery of the Jews. Its technique was the crudity of anti-Semitism. But by now, the forces of anti-fascism were themselves getting organized. News of the coming October Black Shirt March on Stepney had reached the East End in advance, and a growing mass of opposition was mobilized by the communists. The East End would be ready. One of the leaders of the resistance was Phil Piratin, who was later to go to Westminster as a communist MP.
We began to make our plans sometime before October the 4th. And one of the things we were concerned to know about was the movement of the fascists. If they were unable to march according to their planned aims. For this purpose, we decided to call together a number of people as observers. Some people would call them spies. And we gathered together about 24 young people, all of them looking as Aryan as we could find them. So I looked around at this gathering of people, and they all seemed to be suitably enough Aryan looking, except for one, who I then knew was Mr. Faulkner, and I said, I think he'd better step out as he could look Jewish. And he said, I'm not Jewish. He said, I'm of Irish descent. And I said, but you look Jewish.
No, he said, you look more of a bloody Yid than I do.
I don't think I said that. Never mind, if you say so, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. And when he mentioned the kind of job he did, and I realized how valuable that would be to us as an observer, mixing with the medical people who would be helping Mosley, I decided that he should stay.
The anti-black shirt cause was now being vigorously promoted in the communist press.
I remember the communist posters advising us all to turn out and stop the march. The vast notices slung across streets they must not pass, and the turnout early on the morning of that Sunday, with all possessions she wanted to get rid of, going along to old chairs, everything, ropes, barricades. They weren't even going to be allowed to start. And yet in spite of that, I think we all expected them to go through the streets.
And one of those streets was Cable Street, East 1, where the people in 1936 literally went to the barricades thrown up from materials from a nearby builder's yard.
On this occasion, I myself saw the way in which they were stacking up the barricades with mattresses, and the way in which these dockers and labourer types were working alongside the bearded Jews. Now, I'd already lived in Stepney all my life, and I was then 29, and I'd never seen this before. And the important point to me, and it struck me fiercely as I was driving around the motorcycle, was that Mosley was trying to divide the nation. And this counteraction against him helped in uniting the very people he was trying to split.
The communists, they were posing as the real supporters of the Jews and the opponents of fascists, and had rallied their communists from all over England, possibly. Certainly large numbers from Glasgow. And there were the Glaswegians at Gardener's Corner at this big rally, shouting for all they were worth and enjoying themselves tremendously. I think it was the communists who enjoyed it more than anyone, a real rally.
Before the actual day, I got my best suit and borrowed a hat we used to call Anthony Eden hats in those days, a black hat. Borrowed a little black case from a friend of mine. The little black case was empty, as it happens. And when I got to the place I was asked to go and observe, I found a solid line of police.
The police were there not to control the black shirt marchers, but to protect them. The Home Office had refused to divert the march. It was to begin by the Tower of London and the Royal Mint. Hugh Faulkner, the medical student, was there.
So I said, doctor, very firmly, and parted the police, and got through one line of police and then found another line of police. So having succeeded once, I said, doctor again, got through the second line of police and found a third line of police. Got through that too, and then I found myself right in the middle of the Mosley fascists. And just by sheer luck, I happened to catch sight of a member of the Mosley fascists who was at my hospital, who'd once appeared in hospital wearing a black shirt and black boots, and was a very notorious character. And on the spur of the moment, I said, I finally made up my mind. I want to come in with you. And although I was secretary of the Socialist Society in the hospital and had never concealed my views of the fascists, he was such a clot that he immediately accepted this, that on this one day I'd suddenly decided to change my way of life. I was absolutely delighted. And this, I think, was his first recruit, and he was very proud of me, and I was accepted, and almost immediately I was shown a duplicated plan of the route. Said, this is where we're going, and sort of come inside, brother. So I could hardly believe all this, and said, I said, well, if I'm going to stop, I better go and move my car. And so I went out with my little bag and my hat, and through the three police, and then I couldn't get to the phone that I was supposed to use, so I hunted around and finally found a garage.
Hugh Faulkner's instructions were to learn what he could about the black shirt plans and phone his news to the communist headquarters.
And I rang up the number I'd been told and said I'd just seen the plan of march and this was going to happen. I was met with complete incredulity from the other end. Voice obviously didn't believe a word of it. And I was almost in tears trying to explain that I really had seen this. They couldn't think how any of the observers had actually seen the plan. And I didn't know anybody. I didn't know who I was talking to.
Still, the strategy of Phil Peratin and his colleagues was greatly affected by the information coming in from their many observers.
Our main objective was to prevent the fascists marching either along Whitechapel Road or along Commercial Road, because these were the areas where most of the Jewish people were congregated and where the greatest provocation could have been caused. So we called for the masses of people to assemble here.
And assemble they did. They totally filled the area. Bill Fishman was one of them.
I was about 15 at the time. We got here at this spot in Whitechapel High Street. It was a very fine day. The whole of this main thoroughfare was crowded with people. One could hardly get in between one person and another. And there in front of me was a host, a forest of banners. And one banner stands out in my mind. I think it represented the driving force of the people of East London who came out to stop the fascists on that day. They shall not pass. And I remember, although I didn't really understand why I was here, that this is why I had come out with my fellow Jews, that the fascists would not pass in East London.
At a certain time during the morning, during the late morning, the police tried to clear this. One tram, in those days there were trams which went on lines, one tram stopped and the driver took his lock and walked off the tram. Subsequently, other trams stopped there and there. The trams helped the people to take cover when the mounted police charged. They couldn't charge through the trams.
In a different place among that angry crowd, and perhaps with a different reaction, was Edith Ramsay.
At Gardener's Corner, it was a wonderful day, glorious autumn day, sunshine. And there were the mounted police at Gardener's Corner with their batons. I believe they had to use their batons in Cable Street. I never didn't see them use it. They used it in Gardener's Corner. And I was trying to get through, and I had through there because I was going to a Sunday school. And I had to go round backyards by Brunswick Buildings. And there, in the courtyard of Brunswick Buildings, sitting on an old box, was an old Jewish woman with her wig all askew. You know, the Jews have to shave when they marry, not to attract other men. And we had many of those immigrant Jews in their wigs in those days, swaying backwards and forwards, moaning. And I tapped her shoulder and said, "Oh, Granny, Granny, it's all right. It can't happen. Don't worry." And she said to me, "Oh, lady, lady, I have seen it in Poland. It is coming here." And you knew the dread of that age-long persecution, which is the blackest blot on the history of Christendom, was in her mind, as indeed, in some ways, it is and must be in the minds of every Jew.
When more people came along, we directed them down Le Mans Street, so that at one stage this part was also blocked. At that time we gave very little attention whatsoever to the highway because we felt in no circumstances would he march in that direction. The police tried again and again to break the blockage here. They were quite reckless, but they couldn't break through because the crowd was so dense. It was reckoned that there were at least 50,000 people in that area.
In the greater area, there were 250,000 now facing the police.
The police were working in very difficult circumstances, and without a doubt, the rank and file police were carrying out their instructions, but they were as vicious in action as anything I've ever seen, including some of the hunger marches I'd seen where the police were quite vicious. On this occasion, they weren't attacking hunger marches, which was bad enough, but in many cases it was the local people, including women and children, who were there. In one particular case, when I happened to be near Gardener's Corner, when some of the plate glass windows were broken in, among the crowd who had to be picked up was my own young sister-in-law, and I helped to get her away to an ambulance, and her back was lacerated as a result of this. So she was not a grown person, she was then a kid of about 17.
Outside the Mint, the black shirts heard that the police had not been able to beat a path for them through the crowds, and decided to alter their plan. Hugh Faulkner took note of that.
I was then told that they were changing the route because there were too many people in the direction. I could see nothing what was going on outside at all. They was just completely surrounded by black shirts. So I then again had to make some excuse to go out again and say the route had changed. This time there was a sort of some slight belief that I might be talking sense the other end of the telephone.
More and more calls were coming in to the secret communist headquarters.
And on the basis of those telephone calls, some of which had to be double-checked, we ascertained exactly what they were going to do. And so when they began to try and get through here, we had a barricade at this junction here, just over there. We had a further barricade prepared here. This is where we had prepared to overturn a lorry which had been given to us by a local lorry firm for overturning purposes. And we were going to overturn this, and the instructions were to set the light. Those were my instructions. In fact, the chaps in charge here took the wrong lorry. They found the lorry up here, they thought that was the one. They brought it along, the ignition key must have been inside. They turned it over. They also forgot to put it alight. That was another mistake they made. Nevertheless, that lorry, plus other things which we had in the way, prevented the police coming further. When the police broke through here on the first barricade, they met with an opposition here, which in fact was even a surprise to us. All we could attempt to do was to organize people who were out on the demonstration. Obviously, we made no attempt, and we didn't expect to organize people from their homes. It was along this street here in Cable Street that from the roofs and the upper floors, people, ordinary housewives, and elderly women too, were throwing down milk bottles and other weapons and all kinds of refuse which they didn't any longer want in the house onto the police. The Battle of Cable Street is known for this reason. It was there that the police really had to fight for themselves, not for the fascists. It was at that point that police threw down their batons. It was at that point that one or two police actually surrendered. And as souvenirs, the local people, and mostly their dockers living around there in those days, took their helmets and here and there their batons as souvenirs for their children. I saw some of them subsequently. That's why it was called the Battle of Cable Street. And I believe it can be said that irrespective of whether the police were hurt by that, they were certainly very embarrassed to feel that they were now attempting something where they were having the opposition of local people in the very streets where Mosley attempted to march through, and the local police would have known that this also was not a Jewish area, and therefore that must have been the signal that this was really a widespread opposition of Jew and Gentile in that particular vicinity.
Back near the Mint, Hugh Faulkner watched Mosley go and talk to the police commissioner, Sir Philip Game.
Mosley was gesticulating and marching up and down with Sir Philip Game, who was clearly telling him that it was impossible for him to go, and I saw Philip Game shaking his head and putting his hand up and saying clearly this is impossible, and what could they do, and that it was quite clear that the people of Stepney, the people of the East End, were not going to allow Mosley to march with his black shirts through the East End.
We never clashed with this organized mob at all. We were halted by the police and told to disperse about half a mile away. And as usual, we obeyed the police. Then and now, our opponents, when frustrated in any way, attack the police. They don't obey the police, as we did, and maintain law and order.
Subsequently, we heard that Sir Philip Game, having phoned the Home Secretary and been told that he must see it through, we understood that he took his own decision, probably to protect the police, as I said, and told Mosley to get out of it.
So we were prevented doing what we'd often done before, marching through East London in an area where we had this tremendous vote and would certainly have won a parliamentary election at that time.
Later, Sir Oswald Mosley announced in a press release, "This is the first occasion when a British government has surrendered to Red Terror."
You may say, what were we doing in uniform? Prancing around with a private army, as it's been called, and all the rest of it. Well, the origin of that matter was the necessity to fight for free speech. It wasn't only my meetings that were broken up. Everybody's meetings were broken up, whom the communists disagreed with.
At the end of the day, the crowd, who had been fighting the police for many hours, now managed to get their hands on a few black shirts who had not been able to get away. Then, suddenly, it was all over. The Battle of Cable Street was won.
Oh, there was absolute relief. There were parties, there was dancing in the streets, the cafes were full, the pubs were full. And there was a feeling of elation, a feeling of relief, particularly amongst the immigrant Jews, because I think from that day onwards, Mosley never again ventured into the ghetto streets of East London.
But this was more than 30 years ago. That fight is over, but the malady lingers on.
The snivelling hypocrisy of loving their black brothers and sisters.
Mosley may have acknowledged defeat in Cable Street, and the anti-fascists prove their point, but his union movement still holds its meetings around Petticoat Lane. And Geoffrey Ham, a Mosley man undismayed by 30 years of history, brings the old black shirt message into today.
The British workers. In the 1930s, Britain had the greatest empire which the world had ever seen. One which covered a quarter of the Earth's surface. One which had 1/5 of the world's total population. One which had within its borders every foodstuff and raw material you could possibly imagine. And if you had had good, strong government, if you had had the right people at Westminster, that great wealth would have been developed in order to give our people the highest standard of living which the world had ever seen. What really happened in the 1930s? Those old men of the old political parties so mismanaged it all, made such a mess of it all, that 3 million men walked the streets of Britain. And don't you fear again the older men and women in this audience, the old unemployment which kept you in those years, coming back again to this Britain of ours.
In a pub nearby, Mosley's supporters still justify the past.
There was only one thing made Mosley a great leader. What he spoke was true. What he spoke was right. Correct. Why was it? Violence only came at black shirt meetings. For the simple reason, black shirt meetings were attacked. But you never heard violence at communist meetings. You never heard violence.
No, because all you were fighting for were a better standard of living for the type of people that you represented.
Look, that's right.
Unfortunately, Mosley's case was so good and would have been so acceptable to the British people as a whole that the terrorists, inspired by the Communist Party, and you had a lot of aliens in this country at that time that had come from Russia, they were out to destroy his meetings wherever they could, thus preventing the British people from hearing a policy that would have saved this country.
In almost any East End pub, the argument goes on. The old racial debate of the 30s, translated into the uneasy context of today.
No. I'm asking you if you agreed with Oswald Mosley's policy that England should be for the English.
No, I'm not here. Whether I agree...
Yeah, you're putting question.
Let
him answer it.
We're not arguing. We're talking about Mosley's policy.
No.
I'm trying to explain is one thing. I'm only trying to explain is one thing, and I don't care whether you listen to me or whether you don't listen to me. It don't make no difference to me. Mosley was right in when I turn around and say this. He picked on the Jews at the first.
Yeah.
Then he picked on the Irish because they were Southern Irish. Now, all he could pick on was the Spades.
Different times, my friend. Don't talk like that. Done it on one question. Don't you hit on one question. It's different times.
Hey.
Well, hit on the lot. Don't mention black people. That's humanity you're talking about. You talk silly.
That's it.
That's humanity you're talking about. Don't mention colours. Don't mention colours.
You can't bring anything. All right, you're talking about coloured. Who's talking about coloured? We're talking about Mosley. He was a white man.
Keep your voices down. If you want to...
He was a white man. Don't tell me about colour.
He's quite right what he pulled you up just now, Bill. that there wasn't much of a colour race in Great Britain.
There was,
You're talking.
and our friends
No,
got
there
the answer.
definitely was not.
Yes.
There was
Yes.
definitely was not, Bill.
Yes.
You're wrong. No, I'll back you
I
up.
don't care. I don't care. Wally,
30 years ago.
I don't care.
Anyway, so...
I don't care.
Who's he doing this, George?
And I'll tell you what, I'll take everybody from your corner
No, he's wrong.
to there. Yes. Yeah. And I'll say to you that the British Union of Fascists policy was England for the English.
Which is right.
But you're contradicting yourself.
I'm not contradicting myself, I'm contradicting you.
Mosley,
No, you're
here,
wrong.
Mosley stood
I'm
up.
sorry, Bill.
Mosley stood up in Salmon Lane, Commercial Road, in 1936, and said, "England for the English."
Wake up, Britain! Britain first and Britain for the British. Britain is going to become Great Britain again. Is going to play her part in a great Europe. Is going to become part of a great third force in the world. Today, uniforms banned, marches largely banned, but the poor old Union Jack still allowed to fly here and there in England, not quite dragged down yet, not quite replaced by the red flag yet, or the stars and stripes on the other side. A little bit of Britain still left, some corner of a foreign field that is forever England, as Rupert Brooke said. Something of it still left, my friend, symbolized here this morning. Here is real England. Here are the real British people.
Can I ask a question, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, indeed.
How can you make this country great by exporting, as you say, when you've got all these foreigners coming in with their 10 kids, what we've got to keep?
Yes, not only.
That's what I pay nearly £7 a week tax for.
Yes, indeed.
And working bloody hard and all.
I'm sure you do, and I'll give you the answer now.
Second class citizen, that's what I am.
A very good question, and I'll give you the answer.
Because I'm an Englishman. I'm the wrong colour.
The gentleman has drawn attention to the fact, the point I was making. We've got the same problems now as we had in the 30s, and of course...
You've got to be right, you've got to have this colour, the other colour.
And of course, they have now been made worse by the criminal lunacy of the all-party policies of unrestricted coloured immigration.
I'm one of Mr. Wilson's racialists. He made me a racist. Put and face Wilson. I'm not frightened to speak.
All fascists.
Oh yeah, he calls me a fascist because I happen to speak the truth. I speak my mind.
Be proud of it, mate.
I am proud of it. I'm proud of being English. I don't belong to no party. I'm just a man in the street. But if I join your party, they say you're a fascist. I'm an Englishman and I speak my mind, but they won't put me on television. They put their drug takers and their long hair on television. I work 12 hours a day. They put all the do-gooders, the so-no do-gooders on television with their bloody long hair. I don't want to be on television. BBC ain't worth that.
Sooner or later, in the lives of great nations, comes the moment of decision, comes the moment of destiny. And this nation again and again in the great hours of its fate has swept aside convention, has swept aside the little men of talk and of delay, and has decided to follow men and movements who say we